Welcome everybody to another Tartan Ties episode. We're very lucky to have Peter Plaisted, a 1963 school leaver from Scotch College with us. Pete's going to share a whole bunch of insights with us in the form of an oral history a little bit later on. But what we wanted to do as we kicked off was just have a real short, rapid fire understanding of where Pete's from and what his experience at Scotch College was like. So Pete, first question, the most obvious question is, where'd you come from and when did you start at Scotch?
Well, I was born in Kalgoorlie. We were there for the first 4 years of my life because my father was man-powered on the Perseverance mine for gold. And then we moved 4 years later to Gamelling, where my father and his 5 brothers and sister were brought up. He went into partnership with my uncle, but that didn't last longer than about 18 months, and he decided there wasn't enough money for 2 people, so he moved to Perth. I got a job with Plunkets in the building trade. We moved to South Perth, and I went to South Perth Primary School. And as it turned out, I've had 3 or 4 of old boys from Scotch that actually went there at the same time as me, so it was really quite interesting.
So you started what year at Scotch College?
I started here in 1956 when I was 10.
In grade?
5.
Grade 5, okay. What do you remember about that first day at school, if anything?
Well, it's rather interesting because my father took me up because I didn't know anybody at that stage, having come straight from South Perth to there and not knowing who was going to be there. The first person as I rocked up outside where the current memorial hall is, was Lee Jenkinson, the deputy principal. Now, the people that know him, he used to have long hair and spiky hair, and he was rather formidable to a young person of 10 years of age. But fortunately, we went up and my father introduced me, and as it turns out, he taught my father at Scotch in 1931, and he was still at the school. So I had rather an unusual meeting first day at school.
It's nice. Who else in your family has a Scotch history?
Basically, there's 13 Plaisteds that have been through the school, starting at 1926. My grandfather sold an insurance policy in 1931 to allow Dad to come down as a boarder from Gamelling, and he did year 10 because that's all he could afford. You can imagine in 1931, there's no money around.
Yeah.
And he did very well. He scholastically did quite well. He did well in footy, cricket, athletics, represented the Scotch and did very well. And basically the 5 brothers all came down at some stage to the school. And then on top of that, on my mother's side, the Trude family, Vivian Trude went to Scotch here. His son Jack and Tom went here as well. Old Vivian used to be the starter for St Mary's for 35 years in athletics, and he was at Scotch for about 20 years as well. So the connection there was unbelievable. And their family, mum and dad, were both Olympic potential athletes as well. They didn't unfortunately have the money to come to the school, but there's a connection all the way through on both sides of the family.
So you didn't come as a completely unprepared student?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Scared out of my brain for the first couple of days. And fortunately, the first person I had as a teacher, and I met him fairly quickly after I arrived, was Ian Saggers. Yep. And Ian was fairly new into teaching. I think it was either his 2nd or 3rd year. He was about 24 at the time. He was actually quite strict, and I used to get into trouble for talking in class, would you believe?
He didn't change.
And he hasn't changed. So from that perspective, I was very lucky, and he taught me a lot later on in sport.
Who was the headmaster in your time at Scotch?
Maxwell Keys.
Yeah, and he's a storied name, but a lot of boys now don't really know apart from the portrait up the front. What was he like in a couple of words?
He was very school orientated. He was very family orientated. He liked to do well in sport. He liked to promote the school a bit like the current principal does. He encourages the boys all the time to bring out the best in them. If they're scholastic, they do well, whether it's a government school or a private school, but here they're given a chance by their parents, and he always encouraged that side of it, and I think that's very important.
Did you have a favourite subject or a favourite teacher? Or
my favourite subject was probably geography.
Yep.
I quite enjoyed that. Biology. The teachers varied a fair bit because after the war the choice wasn't ideal for the school. I felt sorry for them in a way because they really didn't have a choice. But I think Jock Winter, Rick Russell, there's quite a few good teachers. Peter Cowan, who eventually went on to the university, he was a very good teacher. But everyone had their own pet favourites and others that we had a little bit of difficulty with.
But I think that's interesting, and drill down into that a little bit. Post-war, you know, privations were everywhere. Young men had been off to war and not come back. Difficult choices for men who came back from the war. Damaged. You know, how was the school atmosphere?
Well, a very good example of that was Jock Winter. Now, Jock Winter was in Changi. He told us the story, and he was torpedoed on the way back to Japan after just before the war ended, and he was rescued. And when he came out of Changi, I think he was about, in the old language, about 8 stone, and he was just like skin and bones. But as a teacher, he had absolute respect from the boys. He never had problems with discipline in the class, and because they all knew the story. Another one was Betty Oz Thomas, who was an ex-commando in the war. Similar principle. They were two of the best teachers we ever had because all the boys respected what they had to say because they knew they were born teachers as opposed to someone just looking for a job.
Yeah,
I think
interesting.
that's really important.
Yep. So for you, was it sport or academics?
For who, sorry?
For you.
For me,
What drove you?
non-academic. I just didn't apply myself as well as I might. I was a reasonable sportsman. I wasn't able to make a top football team, but I was in all the tennis teams. And in my final year, they were looking for big blokes to row. So they said, well, you're rowing. So I didn't play tennis at year 12, but I rowed. And I'll just tell you a funny story about that. The first day I was in the first 8, Gordon Barrett Hill was the coach of the first 8, looking for new potential rowers. So we all jumped in the boat at Peppermint Grove, and he said, we're going across to Melville Water. And that's quite a row, first up. So we got out about a kilometre, I suppose, and he said, easy oar. So we all pulled up, and then he comes across the microphone in the boat and says, Plaisted, if you can raise a sweat, I'll buy you an ice cream. So that was my introduction to rowing. After that, I was promoted down to the second 8, and I rowed with a few of my friends under the coaching of Buzz Parkinson and then Tony Bird, and we rowed at the narrows course, and that was really interesting. And I'm glad I did it because even though I didn't get my colours technically for tennis, the fact that you do rowing at school gives you the chance to do something you might not ever do ever again.
And then after you left school, you
after
had
left
various
school,
things
I didn't go too well in year 12, like a lot of my classmates. So I joined the bank, and I was there for 4 years. Then decided that that wasn't enough and went overseas for 12 months. Came back and joined a finance company, and then after that, I had enough of that, and I ended up going to the family business and starting a sports spot down in Cottesloe.
And lots of people will remember that store, and lots of us went there for school uniforms and sports uniforms and sports kit for school as well. Yeah,
that's right. Absolutely.
Back to school then. There was, I think, traditionally a really marked sort of cultural difference between boarders and day boys. How was that when you were at school?
I'd say probably it was a little bit more marked then than it maybe is now.
Yep.
But that's not necessarily bad. I think the day boys, to a certain extent, particularly at sport, were really quite jealous of the boarders because they were tough. I mean, we were just fairies by comparison. I mean, you know, they just looked at us and thought, oh, you're wasting your time with you blokes. And a classic example of that is Mal Brown had kicked a kick at lunchtime. He'd be at one end and Tom Brown at the other. And we might as well not even turn up because we just couldn't get the ball. They were that good, and they were tough, and he didn't worry about that. But I'll just tell you a very quick story about Malcolm Brown. We had the fete, and they were raising money, and they had a boxing troupe in there, and they were raising money for the schools. And the chap said to Malcolm, "Would you like to, come in?" And he said, "Yeah, okay, but you have to put some money on it." And he said, "Oh well, okay. If you reckon you knock me down, I'll give you $100 towards the school." So Malcolm promptly went in, went bang, and the bloke went down and said, "Here's $100. Get going."
I think fundraising's a little bit different nowadays.
Oh, it's quite different. They raised a lot of money back in those days, believe me.
By beating each other up. Who in your school times, particularly while you were at school, who had the biggest impression, made the biggest impression on you?
It's a bit hard to say because you had good teachers and bad teachers, ones that you got on well with, and ones you felt comfortable with. I did enjoy, the sports side of it as well. Not necessarily if you're in a top team, but just the camaraderie between all the blokes in the team. I wasn't good enough to play in the top footy team, which is Austin Robson coaching, but I had Johnny Leonard as my coach in the second 18. And he's 5 premiership coach in the football and Sandover medalist, and his skill level that he passed on to the boys in our year was just unbelievable. And that's what I really did enjoy, the quality coaching that we had while we were at school. That unfortunately, sadly, the boys that don't have the opportunity to come to a school like this don't get, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a really fair observation. The things that you take from not just sports skills but teamwork and all of those other skills that you take out with you.
Well, another interesting one is that in year 9 we went up to Burnbrae, which is an old Uniting Church camp sort of thing. I think it's up in Roleystone or somewhere like that. And we're a year 9, so we had to go up there during like the equivalent of going down to Jarrahdale now. And Alistair Courtney said, look, I'll show you how to ride this bike. And they had an old motorbike there that didn't have an engine. So he jumped onto it, except that he lost control of it and went roaring down the mountainside with no brakes. So it was really quite interesting because we were all laughing our heads off. Of course, you boys in year 9 and the teacher falling off and going sprawling into the scrub was really quite interesting. But on top of that, we had 3 lots of 30 boys. We were split into 3 groups, and they said to each group, righto, who's going to cook? And all the blokes looked at each other. Unfortunately, I knew how to cook. So I ended up being the cook while I was up there, and the other blokes absolutely almost just about starved because none of the boys in the other groups knew how to cook. So that was rather interesting.
What was it like in between the PSA schools? You know, what were the relationships between, or what did you think of the other schools?
Well, surprise.
Who were the friends and who were the enemies?
Sorry, surprise, it's Aquinas, of course. The competition was always very hot. Aquinas. And I remember Mick Barrett and Conor Langer playing on me when I was playing in 16As, just coming up and going straight and tromping straight on my toes, just to know that, you know, we're here. You should just forget it. Same in the tennis, we played Roger Hussey and the boys at Aquinas. It was very competitive there. Hale School was similar, they were very competitive as well, and Christchurch to a lesser extent, but they didn't have the strength that we had, and they weren't as well organised. I mean, that's one thing, Scotch is very well organised when it comes to sport, and the chances of getting injured are a lot less if you play at Scotch, in any sport, and I think that's pretty important.
And what about the girls' schools, and how did Scotch boys meet?
Well, in the time I was at school, we had the sister school with PLC, and then when Bill Dickinson came along, they switched to MLC, and now, unfortunately, it's back to mostly PLC and a little bit of St Hilda's. But the interesting thing is we had dancing classes in year 10, and we used to catch a taxi from the Memorial Hall, and the 5 of us all jump in a cab and go over. But the funny thing was that 2 of the boys were late birthdays in our group, and the mothers didn't realise it, and the boys had to turn up to dancing classes in shorts. Now, if you can imagine a boy in year 9 in shorts in dancing classes trying to woo one of the girls down the side of the dance floor, you can just imagine what it was like. Absolutely terrified. But we did enjoy it, and PLC and Scotch got on very well, and we were lucky with our group that even right through to today, I can bump into people that we met that far back, and they'll know you straight away, and they'll chat to you, and they get on really well. I think that's quite rare, really.
Yeah. And you said there's only 5 of you, so the cohorts were much smaller? Your year groups and the classes were much smaller? Or?
The average size class was, because I was roped in to be the form prefect, so I had to mark the roll off and everything, it was about 32, 33 in each year. There's 4 classes in year 8, that's when they started, and they went 4, 4, 3, 3, 3 on the way through. Yeah.
Who was the student that you most looked up to when you were at school? Everyone has their schoolboy heroes.
Well, of course, most of them back in those days were really the sportsmen. You know, Jack Hudson, Sticks Brayshaw, Austin Robertson. These chaps. But the interesting thing is, the rugby players were involved in quite a big way during the lunch break. Now, the rugby blokes, it's Len Bennett and McCombs and Jack Trail, they played a game called High Cockalorum, which is a Scottish game that's rugby based, and the whole school would be in it. Now, anybody who went to school around about the same time as us would know exactly what I'm talking about, and that was played on the oval. And it got that bad that we had a few dislocations, a few things, so they banned it.
Like we used to play British Bulldog.
No, it's different to that.
Different to that?
You really can't explain it. I think the only thing I would suggest is people have a look on the dictionary and just see how it's played, because
It's rough.
it is like a rugby scrum basically with support. But we would have probably 300 or 400 boys at lunch, like the whole senior school watching at lunchtime. So you could just imagine, and these blokes were probably shaving at 14, you know, they're big, strong rugby types. So anybody else that came along that was a bit light on, well, they didn't even play.
And of course, Jack Trail was an amazing
Right at the
sportsman,
top
went
of the tree.
on to the Olympics.
Absolutely, that's right.
Yeah. Afterwards, so, you know, you sort of, life tends to centre around the sports view and the sportsman. But after all your after all this time, your year group's still pretty close. You meet regularly. Who in that group has been a great achiever?
Well, there's lots of ways you can be achievement,
And,
but sports-wise,
absolutely.
one would be Terry Gale. Financially, John Pearce has done very well, but Graham Shields is a farmer from up in the country. He's absolutely done extremely well. But it's amazing, the test that we did to enter the school that the psychologists put us through, we went 1 to 120, and 4 of the boys that were put in the bottom class were technically the agricultural boys that were non-academic. They came through, and all 3 of them, I won't mention their names, they're all virtually millionaires now. And it just goes to prove that the initial tests aren't the end of the road, because they've done extremely well because they applied themselves. And I'm just so proud of them, because we just see them regularly, you know.
So you were tested.
Yep.
Everybody knew the results of the test and the rankings.
Yes.
Something pretty different.
Well,
to
the big
way
problem
you
is
would
the
do
2 of
things
them had
today.
parents who were teachers, and they said, my student's not staying in that 4th grade, he's going up. So the next year it was adjusted a bit, but Basin Brain, who was the teacher, and I won't mention his name because everyone will know who he is, he just had no idea whatsoever, we don't think at any rate, because it's very difficult when school trying to grade the boys into each of the years. I understand all that, but he was just so far out it wasn't funny. I mean, I was elevated beyond probably higher than I probably should have been, but realistically, we all came together in year 9, and we got on extremely well, because it was difficult. We had a couple of teachers in year 9 that one was an ex-army bloke from the war, and he shouldn't have been there, and we had another bloke that really shouldn't have been there either, so that was difficult for us to get through that. But life's like that. You've got to learn. All the teachers you have aren't necessarily top-notch. But fortunately now, the rules are different.
Got to be top notch. And just maybe if we bring this part of the discussion to a point, reflect on, you know, after this time, how would you characterise, you know, the Scotch experience and the benefits? I'm assuming they're benefits, but there may also be drawbacks to being a Scotch boy during your time and then thereafter. What's different about being a Scotch boy?
Well, I think
for
the big
you than
difference
other
is, and I've
things?
always said this to people, is that all students basically the same, whether it's academic or sport, and whether they have the opportunity to come to a school like this, or Hale or Christchurch or whatever, how they apply themselves is up to them, but they'll do well regardless. Now, the quality of the teaching, the way that schools run, the quality of the coaching when they're playing sport is just the difference, and that's why I think the teachers probably get frustrated sometimes when students come through and don't take full advantage of that. I think that's the big difference, I think, that people look for today. But the experience is very good.
But rather than from the school, for you as a Scotch boy,
well, I wasn't
if you had to give me
academic,
5 words about what being a Scotch boy, now Scotch old Scotch alumni, was about, what would you say you had out of that experience?
Well, obviously the camaraderie between us all, but the important thing was that the boys that were non-academic had all the benefits of all the other things, and that's what I found. Because I wasn't academic, at least other areas of it, I came through. It's strange enough, I was the president of the Road Safety Club. Now you'd think, what the hell's that? But it eventually led on to my interest in traffic, and I eventually became on the Main Roads Customer Council for 5 years and helped them out in certain areas in that area. But I picked it up from school. It wasn't necessarily an academic side of things, but it was a benefit I had because I came here, and one of the teachers was very keen on it.
So, 3 words about Scotch. If you had 3 words to say to
Help me
somebody on
guide
the
along.
street.
Well, helped me, guide me along the way, if that's for,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
absolutely. It prepared me for life later on.
Nice, nice. Thanks for speaking to us today, and we'll go into an oral history with you for the records of the school, but really appreciate the generosity of your time and your experience.
No problem.
You've been on the Old Scotch Committee for many, many years now as a senior member and bring a huge amount to that, and I want to thank you for that as well.
Okay.
Cheers.